Round two. Let's get this done. Yeah. All right. When last we left, we were talking about prisoner's dilemma and how um, aspects, economic tools can help us understand the economic aspects of climate change and just unpredictability in general. I think Rich Campbell, who's a friend of mine from Canada, said this best in one of his early books. He said, the problem with the prisoner's dilemma is that it casts doubt in our understanding of rationality. If the best tools of economics tell us that the rational decision of Nash equilibrium is what's going to make everybody worse off, then that seems to suggest that it might be impossible for rational creatures to cooperate. We just cannot get to the best outcomes, because all of our decision-making procedures push us to the wrong outcomes. There's a general version of this. So prisoner's dilemmas are sometimes called coordination problems, right? It's one instance of many kinds of coordination problems. There are coordination problems that don't involve just two people. Here, I want to talk about something called the free rider problem. Free riders exist everywhere. They exist in biology. They exist in paying your taxes, right? They exist in your friends helping you move. Um, free riding means to gain all of the benefits of people helping each other while not helping people. So when we're talking about paying taxes, a free rider is somebody that doesn't pay their taxes but still uses roads and schools and whatnot. Or we're talking about in biology, a free rider is a parasite. When we're talking about economics, or when you're talking about your friends not helping you move, it's the one that shows up later to get the pizza, or the one that buys the round of drinks, or last or doesn't at all. So a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about the free rider problem. And it's weird that they pop up every time you have organized systems. If I put this class into group activity, which I do in some of my classes, there are some people that won't do the work, that'll rely on other people doing all of the work. And yet, if I were to manipulate the groups so that some people end up in this groups with the other free riders, you would see worse and worse grades overall, right? So free riders depend on there being collaborators, the people that will pay their taxes, the people that will socially isolate and won't cough on people or whatnot. The free rider problem is particularly helpful in understanding what is going on in climate change. Another way of thinking about it has been called the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is when free riders take advantage of common resources so much so that it destroys the common resources. So let's say you have a cow, you and your friend both have a cow, and the cow feeds in this pasture. The pasture is for everybody. Everybody can use this pasture to feed their cow. You think, cool, that's awesome. We're all happy. Yay. But what would be better is if I had a couple of cows. If I had a couple of cows, the pasture's free, so I'm not paying for that. And I could get more milk and whatever you get from cows. So you think, okay, it's free, it's a common resource, so I should use it. I'm just gonna, free ride a little bit, just like take advantage of this resource. Take more than my allotment of toilet paper, for example. but then my neighbor does it, and the other people do it. And before too long, so many people have done it that the pasture dies and everybody dies. It's called a tragedy because everybody is doing what benefits them at the moment, and the consequences can be catastrophic. I think back to that image from Jared Diamond of imagine what it was like to be the last person in an island to chop down the final tree. By the time you're chopping down that tree, it's been too late for a long time. You just didn't know it. But there's a sadness in knowing that, like, by the time the pasture has died, it was inevitable for a long time before that. So Hardin thought that the free rider problem the tragedy of the commons was what was happening in society now. If you look through human history, you'll see that for a long, long, long time, there were only a couple of million people on the planet, a couple of dozen million people. Actually, if you go back long enough, there's only a couple of thousand humans. And then in modernity, in the 1700s, the population quadruples, and then it keeps doubling shortly every couple of decades thereafter. In the turn of the 1900s, we're over 1 billion people. By the year 2000, we're at 6 billion, and now we're past 7, expecting to hit 9 by the end of by the middle of the century. So you think, okay, holy hell. It's almost as if we are having too many humans, Garrett Hardin says, and we're consuming all of the resources, and the planet is the commons. And when you look throughout this population boom, you see, yeah, population has increased, carbon dioxide has increased, nitrous oxide has increased, methane has increased, the temperature has increased. So it seems obvious that, like, there's a relationship here. Hardin definitely thought so, and I think a lot of people do blame population for everything. But I think the causation here is the wrong way around. I think the problem isn't people, it's the kinds of people, right? So half of the world's resources are consumed by the top 10%, which includes most of us. Half. That means that you could double the population of people that are hunter-gatherers, and you wouldn't really notice an increase in any of, pollution, carbon dioxide, methane, any of those things. You could quadruple them and you wouldn't notice it. You could double all of the subsistence farmers on the planet and it would just be a blip. But if you try to have the population of the United States double, or of Europe, or you bring China out of poverty and have that population live like people in the United States do, then pretty soon you do get into a tragedy of the commons. So it's not actually population. This is key. Population is not the problem. It's how it is used. So some countries punch above their weight in terms of consuming more resources, polluting more, burning more oil, that kind of stuff. The United States is not at the top of that list, but it is in the top 10. Right, we're number 5. A lot of Middle Eastern countries are just, they make a lot of their money from oil, so it makes sense that they would be very polluting countries. It just so happens that their population is much, 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 much smaller than our population. The United States has the third biggest greatest population of the planet. We have something close to 320 million people living in this country. It is the 5th largest country on the planet. And so we we consume a whole hell of a lot of resources. And we punch above our weight, but not as, not as much as each individual person in Qatar. Qatar, sorry. Okay, so tragedy of the commons, right? Hardin thought that we were in a tragedy of the commons because of population. He saw that population was increasing. I think that's a bit simplistic, at least blaming it all on population. I think the way the population is distributed matters. But you could ask this question about whether we actually are in a tragedy of the commons, right? And tragedies of the commons, like the prisoner's dilemma, like the free rider problem, have some technical aspects that you can just look for. So first, there has to be a shared resource or burden. And it's got to be possible for certain actions to benefit some people and not others. And those have to lead to really negative consequences. So you think, okay, maybe the environment is like that, right? So some countries really pollute quite a bit, and they get a lot out of it because it helps their GDP. But everywhere else regrets it, right? Because there's more childhood asthma, people can't see the stars, what have you. So shared burden seems to be a check. Are individual actions uncorrelated? For something to be a tragedy of the commons, it has to be that people are not all deciding together to do things. They're not collaborating. They're just trying to benefit themselves. And that seems to happen whether you look at this at the individual level, the national level, or some sort of other level. Our actions are at best imperfectly correlated. Is there punishment for countries that consume more resources than other countries? I mean, not really. It's a little shame, I guess, but how much does shame actually matter to individual people living in countries? Do we feel ashamed to be the only country that's not in the Paris Agreement? I don't know. And are the actions that we're doing not Pareto optimal? That is to say, can you think of a scenario where everybody is better off? Probably every society you can think of scenarios where they would be better off. Probably not for every individual, right? There's a couple of billionaires that are living their best lives right now. So it seems like most of these checkboxes are checked. We might be in the tragedy of the commons. So, okay, all right, let's say we're in a tragedy of the commons. Let's say we are facing an environmental catastrophe, and the only way out is to try to solve this tragedy of the commons. Well, how do other people solve tragedy of the commons in general? Sometimes what you do is you just privatize everything, right? Instead of it being a common resource, you just say, okay, pay me 50 cents for everything that your cow eats in this pasture, or for every acre or whatever. That works for some things. I don't think it works in an environmental scenario, just because sometimes it's hard to track down who did what, and everybody has to like deal with the environment. You can't really make all of the best air go to a certain place. Although you probably could do that with water. Other solutions to the tragedy of the commons is just, not worry about it. Just like be happy. It's not a great solution. But if the tragedy of the commons is because it produces something that nobody likes, well, all you have to do is change what people like. All right, so that's not great. There could be collective decisions. We could all just get together in a room and decide, hey, let's all try to like motivate each other. So the nations of the world have done this with climate change. We've got the Paris Agreement. Before that, we had Kyoto. We tried to do this with Copenhagen. Lots of various agreements we'll talk about later that aim to coerce participants to behave more environmentally. And ideally, you would want that to be some administered in such a way that it doesn't actually make the problem worse. Other tragedies of the commons are solved by external coercion, right? So think about professional sports. Every single team wants to cheat as much as possible because it gives them an edge and it makes them more likely to go to the next game and whatnot to get more revenue. But nobody wants to watch the NFL if it were all cheaters. Nobody wants to watch a league of cheaters. So what we do is everybody gets together and the league owners say, okay, we will have referees and these will be the rules. And we agree to abide by what the referees say. They can give us penalties and change the way the game is going if they don't think we're playing according to these rules. So external coercion, right? That could be another thing. In climate change, it's difficult to imagine what this would be. It's not like we could get aliens here to coerce us, but maybe we could get, embody some particular body like the United Nations or something to enforce their rules on each nation. And lastly, you can actually try to attach costs to resources or increase the resources themselves. We're destroying Earth. Let's just build an Earth 2. We're destroying Earth. You know what? Make it so that anybody that pollutes gets fined. Okay. All right, so those are ways that we can solve tragedies of the commons. Again, and I've said this in a couple of other discussions in climate change, like these issues are political in nature. That is to say, there is nothing God ordained. There is no law of nature that says that we must be stuck in this situation. Humans got us to this place. Humans can get us out. And it's especially important to do this as uncertainty increases. So the reason we care about economics is because they spend a lot of time thinking about what happens with things that you care about as uncertainty increases. And the thing about climate change is there are some things that are very, very, very predictable. I think that the oceans will rise is predictable based on what we do now. Like, it would basically be impossible to stop that at this point. How we respond to it, whether we let Mauritania drown or whether everybody gets flown out and sets up shop in like Qatar or whatnot, that's a different thing. And you might be able to make predictions based on whether you think that the nations of the world will get their act together. But as we move forward in time and in complexity, things become less and less certain. So what will happen, when, where, and how becomes less certain because humans are this X factor and humans respond to facts on the ground by changing their behaviors. I was worried about coronavirus back in January. I thought it would kill lots of people. I didn't realize that the United States had it in its arsenal to shut down restaurants and schools. So those are the kinds of predictions that I would have failed at with coronavirus, but climate scientists and climate policy experts have to try to get right, have to try to predict with respect to this particular issue. It's a hard task to try to predict a global response to an abstract and chaotic future. But that's what we're doing. All right, so in this video, we talked about the free rider problem, which I argued was a more generalized version of the prisoner's dilemma. And then we applied to the tragedy of the commons, which some people have at least argued that was due to population. I argued against that. And then we talked about whether we are in a tragedy of the commons with respect to climate, and if so, how can we deal with it? What should we do? All right, that is that is that for the second video on this economics section. There's going to be at least one more.